Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My name is Alice Lee Hagan. Welcome to our show. My guest today is Stuart Huang. He is the lecturer of law at the Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. Well, he also, maybe I should welcome you first.
Thank you.
Stuart,
thank you for inviting
so
me.
much.
Happy to be here.
Well, I know you're a returning guest, but let me do a little bit more introduction.
Okay.
Now, I know that you moved here to Hawaii a couple of years ago,
Yes.
but prior to that, you founded your intellectual property practice and had a very successful career at Steptoe & Johnson. And even before that, before becoming an attorney, you were an engineer. So I know that a year ago you came onto the show and you had an extensive conversation with Danielle Conway on intellectual property on the islands. So I guess some of the things that I really like to cover is, well, of course I met you at the at Shiloh College of Business when you came to give a presentation to our Korean visitors on intellectual property. So I like I guess an update on that, but more importantly, when I was reviewing your show with Danielle, you talked about technology and innovation, and she suggested that you should come back and talk to her about it.
Okay, well,
so
we can talk about that too.
And then, and some of the challenges and opportunities for our state. So first off, tell us about your practice prior to moving to Hawaii.
My practice before Hawaii, I had a law practice in Washington, D.C. at Steptoe & Johnson. Most of my work was intellectual property in one form or another, or things somewhat related to it. A common theme throughout all my practice was technology, so I typically represented technology clients, and I worked on matters where the technology was somehow in dispute. So someone may have accused another company of stealing technology or infringing a patent, or they were trying to get out of an accusation of infringement or something like that. So a lot of my cases tended to deal with either patent infringement or trade secret misappropriation, copyright infringement if it was software, and working with clients to use the law to help them in their businesses, their technology businesses.
Okay. Now, intellectual property related to technology, but when you first joined the law firm, and if I remember correctly, intellectual property is really still at a very early stage. So how did you get into it?
Well, I began my adult life after I was in college, and I had a strong interest in science. Started off actually pre-med, and
oh my gosh, really? Wow.
I had a father who wanted me to be a doctor, and I rebelled, as sons are wont to do. But so I studied science in college, and my first job was as an engineer. I ended up going back to school, getting a master's degree in electrical engineering, and so...
Was your dad okay with you being an engineer instead of a medical doctor?
I think he would have preferred a medical doctor.
Okay.
But I had a good job, and so, that was fine. I was one less to worry about. And so my first interest was technology, engineering, designing things, science, and at some point I made a decision to go to law school. Not really intending to be a lawyer. I sort of saw it as a bit of a joke, I guess, or a lark, a couple of years of not working to have some fun and learn some things. My original plan was to go back into the engineering community now as a middle manager, or maybe with a upper management direction, thinking that knowledge of law would help in business. And I decided, though, when I graduated from law school, that I really should complete that process. I should get a job in a law firm, pass the bar, become a lawyer, get my license to practice. So I got a job, and the unseen hand of the marketplace pushed me into patents. So all the patent firms in Washington, D.C. loved me and competed to get me into their firms. So I ended up, my first legal job after law school was as a patent lawyer.
But we need to backtrack a little bit, right? Because when you were an engineer with Pratt & Whitney, you actually invented you have patents.
I do have patents.
Patent holders, right?
I have some inventions. I'm a named inventor on some patents. So in the early phase, I was designing things. So my first job with Pratt & Whitney, we were I was working with a group that was the first to put a computer control on a jet engine in the US.
Oh, wow.
And that sparked an interest in electronics. So that was sort of how I moved from sort of more of a pre-med to a more of an electrical engineering side. I went back, got my graduate degree in electrical engineering, went to work for an electronics company as a circuit designer. So I've always had this sort of technology foundation to my life.
Okay.
As a my inventions, as named patents, actually came later when I was working with clients, and many times some of my clients would be stuck with a problem. And I just thought it was fun. I'd sit around, talk with them, and we'd sort of say, well, they would want to do something. I'd say, well, what if you did it this way? And they go, oh, yeah, that's a really good idea. And I think, uh-oh, I just had an invention. He didn't, my client didn't think of it. I thought of it, which means that I'm an inventor of that, or a co-inventor of whatever it was what we were working on. So most of my inventions tended to be co-inventions with other people, where my client and I ended up kind of by accident, or not because of my legal practice, brainstorming on how to deal with some technical problems.
This is fascinating. I know that I prepared a list of questions for you, but this is not on it.
Okay.
Now,
Anywhere
you
you want to
have
go is
an
fine.
engineering background. Is that how? This must be really unusual to have an engineering training and then eventually you become an attorney, or
It's an unusual combination.
does it help with the way you think about law? Do you think about it differently because of your engineering and medical training?
It helps and it hurts.
Oh.
It's a two-edged sword.
Okay.
So law tries to be logical. We have rules, we call them laws, and we have what should be a fairly objective way of determining whether you're behaving lawfully or not. So there are little analyses people do called legal analysis to see, does the law apply? Are you within the law? Or are you not within the law? Engineering is very rigorous in its analysis. So the mental rigor of doing a long engineering problem, maybe a 10-step or a 12-step math problem, requires a lot of discipline and logic to it. And that part helps in law. But law is not entirely logical. Law is fuzzy.
Okay.
And particularly when you start getting into things like lawsuits where you're trying to persuade a jury or a judge that your side is right and their side is wrong, there's the law, but people make decisions on other factors. They like you, they don't like you, they think you, there's a sympathy to what you did or your position. They affiliate with your good goals and your good intention, even if you made a mistake and did something bad, versus someone who's bad in their intention. So there's a human element to law.
And it's a matter of persuasion and how eloquent you are, which
It helps to be
wordsmith.
It helps to be more verbal, to persuade, to communicate to people. Engineers are not notoriously good at communication.
That's right.
Our undergraduate training usually has maybe a semester or two of English, and after that, all of our tests are just equations or things like that. So we don't, as engineers, develop language skills the way, say, a history major might, or an English major might, or a political science major might. We don't write a lot of papers in college. So the biggest challenge for me there was to beef up other skills that I did not get when I was in my engineering program. So some things are good. Being an engineer gives you that kind of logic. But it left me somewhat underdeveloped in other skills that my competitors and cohorts got as English majors and history majors.
Wow. Now you mentioned lawsuits, and I remember in your previous, let's say, how about your presentation at the college? You talk about, I know you talk about chip laws, and I know that you've worked with some big name companies. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay. Companies today live in a global environment. We don't just design, build, and sell within the United States, particularly with technology. So if you are making electronic products or software products, airplanes, some of the things that the American economy excels at, have a high content of what we call intellectual property. There's technology in there, there's copyrighted, there are movies, there's software, there's music. And we supply the ideas and the designs then to China or other countries where things are manufactured at lower cost. And then those products, those final products, come back into the US. So we have this global supply chain where things move around. Intellectual property is a way to help make all of that work well, because if you spend a lot of money for a company and you invest a lot in developing technology, it's hard to recover your investment if another company outside the US can just copy it and compete only on the basis of manufacturing costs, where their manufacturing costs are lower. So we use intellectual property and patents to sort of keep everything working the way it's supposed to work. The inventors and the designers send it to the manufacturers, and the intellectual property laws say the manufacturer is not supposed to steal it. And then the manufacturer returns the products to the US, and the intellectual property laws say competitors are not supposed to steal it. So the investment that went into envisioning and developing the product to begin with is protected, and then when you get finally to the sales stage, the inventors and the developers can recover that investment.
But of course, this is an ideal framework.
Yeah.
So that's where you come in as
Right.
an intellectual property attorney.
Right. It's one way.
Okay. Now, I know that, well, perhaps, recently, the litigation between Samsung and Apple, I guess that's an example of technology companies, their competition and having to take it to the court to duke it out. So do you care to share some insight on that litigation issue with us?
On the Samsung Apple case, or litigation in general?
No, Samsung and Apple.
Okay. Yeah, I was not directly involved in any of those cases. I did do work for Samsung in the past. I actually represented Samsung in one lawsuit and probably about 100 patent applications in front of the patent office. So I did work for them in the past. I think there are two things going on. One is market protection. So patents can be part of the competitive chessboard for companies.
Okay.
If a company has a lot of patents, if one company has a lot of patents, another company does not have a lot of patents, you can have a game, competitive tactic, where the company with patents will use the patents to keep the other companies out of their American market, or if they have patents in Europe, out of the European market, or their whatever geographic market they're in. So when I was doing work in the 1990s for Samsung, Texas Instruments was competing with Asian chip makers that were then just becoming competitive. And Texas Instruments used its patents to keep the competitors out of the US market.
Okay.
So one example was memory chips. Texas Instrument had patents on memory chips. The Japanese and Korean companies were making memory chips at a very low cost. And Texas Instruments would sue to prevent those Asian companies from bringing in chips using TI's patented technology. So it was a legitimate lawsuit, as long as those products did in fact use the technology that TI had patented. Now, we debated whether the Samsung chips did use TI technology. That's a different story. So that gave Texas Instruments some protection over its market. They had bigger market share. Patents let you support a higher price for your products if you don't have competition.
So it's like tariffs then. They're protecting the market.
It has that effect. It has that effect. And in an age of free trade, it's one of the few ways that companies can still try to protect their markets. So that's the case where you have one company with a lot of patents, another company without many patents. That allows this strategic play. But then you get a situation where two companies both have patents. And that's a little more like the Apple-Samsung case.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So Apple has quite a few patents. They brought lawsuits all over the world. They're not just lawsuits in the US against Samsung. Samsung countersued for patent infringement based on Samsung's patents, because Samsung has designers, they're inventing things too. And what often happens is the portfolios of patents cancel out.
Oh, what do you mean by that?
So both sides end up infringing the other side's patents.
Oh, okay.
And lawsuits in that situation do not necessarily give a net advantage to one side or the other. So if I infringe your patents and I owe you $1 million, and you infringe my patents and you owe me $1 million, and we each spend $1 million to pay our lawyers, all we've really done is lost $2 million.
Well, of course,
because we pay the lawyers, but neither one of us gets an advantage.
Of course, the question then is from somebody who is not in law, why couldn't they have worked it out? I mean, why do they have to fight it out?
Well, that's part of the human dynamic.
I see.
Probably, I can't say for sure because I'm not involved with either company. My guess would be that someone at Apple saw Samsung taking market share. And someone at Apple said to their team, do something.
Okay.
And somewhere within the Apple team, someone said, we have patents. We can potentially sue Samsung, prevent Samsung from bringing products into the US market. And if Samsung cannot bring the products in, Apple can recover some of our market share.
So, well, I guess at the end, it is a business decision then,
Oh,
of
yes,
course.
it absolutely is a business decision. Now, the people on the Apple side who are making that decision would not, it's like almost like a football game, would not necessarily know what Samsung is thinking.
Right.
So once the game begins, Samsung has defenses, and some of Samsung's defenses are to countersue. So what happens in a lot of industries is the bigger companies all get substantial portfolios of patents, and then they agree to global peace. They say, we are not going to fight it out with patents. We'll instead fight it out on our products in the marketplace, because if they're relatively evenly matched, it's just a wasteful exercise.
Well, we're coming on our first break, but I think after the break, I'd like to ask you, given everything that has happened after the litigation, do you think they would do you think that they have second thoughts, or would they have done things differently? So that's a question I want to ask you.
Okay.
My guest is Stuart Huang. He is a lecturer of law at Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. You're watching ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. We'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Kili'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My guest is Stuart Huang, lecturer of law from the University of Hawaii Richardson School of Law. Before the break, we were talking about his career at Steptoe and Johnson in intellectual property practice. So Stuart, we were talking about the litigation between Samsung and Apple. They're suing each other, countersuing, and after the dust has settled, do you think that in retrospect they would have done things differently?
I don't know. I don't personally have any insight into what was the original decision by Apple to begin its suits or Samsung, but in many industries, they go through this evolution where for a long period of time, none of the companies worry about IP or patents, and they're competing on the basis of their products. Somewhere along the way, usually one or the other kind of discovers the intellectual property game, and they've been getting patents or intellectual property, and at some point become tempted to assert their patents and become more aggressive. And that triggers everyone else in the industry to then become defensive, and then they get their patents, and everything ends up sort of equalizing out again. So many industries have reached an equilibrium. Electronics industry is one where most of the bigger companies have large patent portfolios, and they tend not to sue each other. Other industries like the pharmaceutical industry, they're also They rely very heavily on their patents. And it's a little bit like a game of tic-tac-toe. There are only so many outcomes. And everybody knows the game, and you sort of know if you have a chance of winning or not. And if, I personally think, and this isn't saying whether Apple or Samsung would have thought differently, but if you know the game, you should be able to have a pretty good guess at the beginning what the outcome is likely to be. And it's not ever always perfect, but big patent wars have sometimes been very successful, but they've also frequently just been wasteful. And so I think it's really a question of judging whether you as the patent owner just have more ammunition. Whether you've got more stuff to shoot at the other side and they don't have as much stuff to shoot back, then you can get an advantage. Quite a few companies have what are called cross-license agreements, where they have gone to each other and they said, if you're a company that is a competitor with your patents, I'm a company with my patents, we come together, we say, let's not fight. I'll give you a license under all my patents. If you give me a license under all of your patents, we won't worry about fighting each other. We'll just concentrate on beating back the upstarts or others who we think are a competitive threat. And it's a little bit like, Russia and Europe decide to have a peace treaty. It's just more efficient not to be at war than to be at war.
I like this analogy of yours, because when I thought about interviewing you, talking about intellectual property and patent, I said, I am not at that level, but you make it easy to understand, really.
It's not complicated, it's just foreign. Most people aren't exposed to it.
Okay.
But it comes out to be very similar to all other conflicts that human beings have.
Right.
I have a saying that was actually from a German general or a Prussian general named von Clausewitz. And he was talking about real war, shooting with guns war. And the rough translation is, war is a continuation of diplomacy by other means.
Interesting.
And I've adapted that to patents and litigation, which is, patents and litigation are a continuation of negotiation by other means. So companies want to accomplish things. They want markets, they want products, they're constantly making deals. In every deal, there's always a little bit of a threat of hardball. If you don't make the deal, what will happen? And oftentimes the threat is litigation. So companies will negotiate over things like whether or not a product is infringing or whatever. And against that backdrop is always the question, if we don't reach a deal and we start suing each other, what will the result be? And for businesses, intellectual property ultimately, in my view, is a return on equity question. They're paying patent lawyers and they're going through this process of acquiring patents. So it's an investment for them. Money is going into their patent portfolio. And they want to see some kind of return on that. Otherwise, they're better off spending the money on engineers or marketing or advertising or opening a new factory. So the capital has all these different demands. Patents and patent services are one. So there's some level where it kind of makes sense. If a technology company has no patents and they end up losing all their technology to copyists, then it probably is worth it for them to spend more money protecting it to avoid copying. And litigation is part of that equation. At some point, if they have invested in the patents, what do they do with them? If they just sit there by themselves, they may be providing value. The way the nuclear bomb provides value without throwing it at anybody.
About that.
It's like the nuclear option. The bomb, even if you don't use it, is still preserving the peace. And so that's what role patent portfolios play with a lot of companies. They have them, and it's keeping the peace. But then there are times when war breaks out, and then you start throwing them.
Well, let's not hold that.
Yeah.
Now, you talked about value and patents, and I know earlier on you mentioned how perhaps in the US we have a lot of patents, and in the whole frame of manufacturing, having invented something new, having a patent, that's kind of a high value item. And if I can ask the producer to show us the the patents that are issued in the U.S., and I think that's a slide that you use for the Korean visitors. Yes. I'd like to ask you a question about how we're doing in the U.S. in terms of inventions have being, I guess, the foremost in our patents in creation. So, producer, may I have that slide?
Yes.
Because I know that you talked about Texas Instrument. They had a lot of patents.
Yes.
But down that list, and of course, there are up-and-coming countries like Korea, Japan, like Fujitsu, and I'm not quite sure, Toshiba is on the list.
Toshiba, Panasonic, Hitachi, Qualcomm.
How are we, as a country, how can we compare ourselves with the rest of these emerging developed countries in terms of patents, and what does it say about our economy?
I think we do well. The slide sort of suggests, if you look at the top 15, only a few of those are U.S. companies. You may think, oh my gosh, we're falling behind. That's really not the case. There are many other countries out there.
And is that only limited to technology, or any patents, whether it be pharmaceutical or other inventions that's not technology? Does it?
That list, I believe, is all patents.
Okay.
The list tends to be a little heavy on the electronics company side, partly because electronics are such a huge international global market. Televisions and computers are such a part of our economy. General Electric was on the list, though. They do a lot of interesting things like medical imaging. So if you go through the list, you may say there are only a couple of U.S. companies there, but if you look at any one country, no country has more than a couple on the list anyway. So Germany may only have a few, Japan has a few, Korea has a few. And so I think we are doing well compared to the world. Our culture is very entrepreneurial. Even our big corporations are innovating, and that leads to a lot of innovation. We rely very heavily on patents. The list also reflects that many other countries that used to be considered sort of, quote, developing are actually coming on into parity with the U.S. And so they are adopting the same practices the U.S. has. So in Europe, I think Siemens is on the list. They have a lot of patents. Fujitsu is on the list. They have a lot of patents. These are now sophisticated companies. After World War II, America was fortunate. We had no fighting on American soil. Our factories were not bombed to the ground. So we had a easy competitive advantage in the 1950s and the 1960s. Europe and Japan had to rebuild from scratch. They have, over the years, developed their own capabilities. And so we have a number of countries that are all very capable. And I think that's what the list mostly shows. Countries you do not see on that list, maybe say something as well. For example, I don't believe that list has any Indian companies on it. Right. India is considered a developing country. Right. They have some industries where they are doing a lot of work. They've put a lot of money into their pharmaceutical industry. Over time, as those countries' internal industries develop more, they'll become more users of intellectual property services.
So you said that we have a competitive advantage after the wars. We still do, but how sustainable is that? I mean, there are up-and-coming countries, as you mentioned, India, and of course China. Do they have patents? I mean, it's obviously they're not on the list, but
there are countries, inventors in countries outside the U.S. It takes a long time for a country to develop a high-tech industry. It's not just bringing in some people. It requires an education system, it requires an infrastructure, it requires capital. And countries are sort of at various places. Japan has become an innovator and a source of inventions. Korea, arguably over the last 20 years, has made a lot of that transition. I don't know where the global economy is going. It's a lot easier to adopt technology than to advance technology. So if you're a developing country looking at, say, the United States or Europe or Japan, the developing country can see high technology out there and can go out and buy it and bring it in. So it's easy to import technology and raise standards of living. Once you get sort of up level with everyone else, then inventing new things, pushing the state of the art of science, pushing the state of the art of design is harder. It's easier to see something and bring it over than it is to invent it.
Right.
So places like China is looking at their GDP growth as sort of a surrogate measure. They can grow at 7% a year because they're starting from a relatively low level and they can import a lot. What you find is developed countries typically have growth rates in the 2 to 3% per year. And part of that is because you hit that barrier, which is harder to keep pushing your technology ahead. So the developing countries can grow faster until they sort of catch up, and then they're going to be like the rest of us. Then they have to independently start having smart people, well-educated people with resources, with laboratories, to then start pushing the state-of-the-art back. And that's just a lot harder. And that ends up being a 1 to 2% rate, not a 7 to 9% rate.
But yeah, that's another conversation that we can spend another show doing.
I'm not an economist, so I'm not sure you want me to go there, but...
But it's an interesting perspective. But we're coming on a second break, and I want to ask you about your interest in technology and innovation and all your different interests during our third segment.
Okay.
Great. My guest is Stuart Huang. He is the lecturer of law at the University of Hawaii Richardson School of Law. We'll be right back.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance, Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Hi, my name is Andrew Howard. I'm an astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii up in Manoa. I'd like to tell you about the annual open house that we're having. This year it is on April 6th, 11 to 4 p.m. It's an all ages event, kids, grown-ups, even people in between, everyone is welcome. We have a lot of really fun activities. You get to meet astronomers, look at yourself in an infrared camera, play with Legos, make robots, look at videos. You can even make some of the kids like to make comets out of gravel and snow. Even adults like to do that too. You'll be able to look at the sun with a solar camera safely. It's really a great activity. We do this every year in April, and I hope to see you this year. Thanks.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. This is Alice Lee Hagan. My guest today is Stuart Huang. He is a lecturer of law at the University of Hawaii Richardson School of Law. So Stuart, you talked about Samsung, Apple, you talked about patents, and it's good to know that we are still at a competitive advantage. It's good to know that there are so many patents out there and all the other countries are contributing towards it. But now I want to change subject and talk about your diverse interests. So first of all, I'd like to show this picture of you, which is something that was really unexpected when I saw that at the presentation to the Korean visitors.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about that and where you are exactly and what you're doing.
Oh, boy. I'm not sure where I am.
Okay.
Personal note, not really professional, but I went through a personal transition in my life. I had been a lawyer. I had been doing technology law and litigation, and I decided a number of years ago that I have other interests in life and I was going to start pursuing some of them. So that picture is from a phase where I was exploring interests. And I have a friend, Indian, he's Sikh, wears the turban, kind of a guru in the original sense of the word. His father runs an ashram in India, and we chatted about personal growth and that kind of stuff. And he said, Stuart, when you want to try something, you don't just dip your toe in the water. You go at least a whole leg before you decide whether you like it or not. So I had been a scuba diver most of my life, and as a recreational diver. It just was fun, something to do. I'd take my vacations. It was a distraction from my work. And so I decided to see how I could use it more effectively and take it beyond just an amusement to something that had more meaning. And so I was over at the University of Hawaii Hilo, and they have a wonderful, the University of Hawaii in general, but also in Hilo here in Manoa, they have very good dive programs because we have a good oceanography program here in Hawaii. We're in the ocean. We have people who study the ocean, and people who study the ocean go into the ocean. So we have a lot of scientific divers, not recreational divers, not just there to have fun. They're looking for coral disease, or they're placing equipment or they're doing something for their science, for their research that's underwater, and diving is how they get to where they need to be to do their jobs. So there's a different authorization called scientific diver, and I was authorized as a science diver at the U.S. That shot was part of a workshop where they were teaching us underwater coral reef survey techniques. It's actually a class that's offered at the university if you are a marine scientist or a diver, or even sometimes they don't necessarily have to be a marine scientist to be in the program. But they kind of take your skill level up to a new level, your diving skill, and teach you how to do things like identify coral disease, measure the percent coral cover. There are scientific measurements you make of reefs, coral reefs, to evaluate the health of the reef. And so I was thinking maybe I would like to do this much more seriously, and so I took the classes, and that picture was from a team dive. We had 5 divers in the water, all working in the same area. I forget exactly which one that was, but you said there's a clipboard, so we have paper. We actually write things down underwater.
You can do that?
You can. Pencils. Use a pencil, don't use a pen.
So did you find out whether this is an interest that you would like to continue to pursue?
Well, I love doing it. I'm not sure if I will continue pursuing it professionally.
Okay.
If I had an opportunity, I would love to do it. I think I have the skill set, but I'm getting older, and there are physical demands to being in the ocean on a rough day, trying to get work done, and there are a lot of really such deserving and passionate new crop of marine scientists coming along who love it as much, if not more, than I do. So I'll probably not go further down the professional science diver range, although I love diving, and the experience means now when I go into water, instead of just saying, oh, look, pretty yellow fish, I now go into water and I say, ooh, look, not only is that a pretty yellow fish, I know its scientific name, I know something about its habits, I know what it eats.
Wow.
And so it's a richer experience for me,
course.
so that's really great.
Of course. Now, I know that earlier on we talked about your engineering training and how perhaps it has influenced the way you have become an attorney. Then going back to your, I guess, lifelong interest in technology and innovation, it seems that now that you've retired from being an attorney, you are coming back to technology and innovation. Tell us some of the projects that you are working on.
Okay, my big project right now, my personal project, is trying to coordinate a little scientific research between the University of Hawaii Med School and the College of Engineering. There are many, I hate to use the word problems, but there are things we can do to improve our healthcare system. And sometimes the people who are really well versed on the medicine side do not know the capabilities of electronics. And sometimes people who really know the capabilities of electronics don't know what to do with their electronics. They have these wonderful devices and they don't always know where to put it to practice. And so I've identified an area where I think we can take existing technology, apply it to a hospital setting to monitor infectious disease in hospitals. And so I'm trying to coordinate these 2 different groups, actually more than 2, to find a site where we can take some electronics, develop a monitoring project, try it out somewhere in a hospital, and see if we can help reduce the rates of infections. You go into a hospital, people get sick, they pick up an infection. There are these drug-resistant pathogens that are problematic. And so if we can find ways to operate our hospitals better, hopefully we can reduce these levels of infections. And I think there's some electronic monitoring things we can do. So without getting too far into details, it pulls together some different aspects of my past. So I have some ability in electronics.
Medical training.
I have some experience in medicine. I've worked with technology development. I've worked with, as an attorney, I advise clients who are doing startups who are trying to bring new products to market. So I, as a personal philosophical direction in my life, asked what's my best and highest use. I'm too young to retire and play golf until I die. I'm still active and engaged and part of society. And so I've decided that this is a project that I may be uniquely positioned to do because of my unusual background. I can do some good, make contributions, and have some fun. So that's part of what I'm doing.
Again, bringing in, as you say, all your skill sets that you have, and you have so many of them. But how did this project come about? Is this a unique project? Are other hospitals or healthcare systems looking into infectious disease in medical facilities?
It began with another client of mine who had an idea, not quite along these lines, but he was an electrical engineer and was developing a system. It's a little bit of what I call a solution in search of a problem. It was an interesting technology he was developing. He wasn't really quite sure where it would best be deployed. He had lots of ideas, but so the idea that I'm working on is sort of a variation of something he did. I didn't come up with it completely myself, but I did take something that he'd started and took it in a different direction. So that's the way things are. Things move around. One way to have creativity, one way to have invention, is to cross-pollinate.
Right.
And so this is part of a cross-pollination. So I spent almost a good part of a year studying infectious disease papers. I was reading these scientific papers on MRSA, drug-resistant staph, and these other things, and looking at the economics around how our healthcare system is reimbursing or not reimbursing, and who's paying for these things. And the more I began to go down some of the different paths, it looked a little bit at the technology, it looked some at the science, it looked some at the finance, it looked some at the marketing, the various pieces that as an entrepreneur you put together from these different areas. And I continue to believe that it's a worthwhile project. And so about fall of last year, I decided that there were some potential problems, things we don't know, and put together a small research project, or am putting it together. I'm not even sure it's off the ground yet, but I'm putting together a small research project to answer some questions, to try to say, from a more scientific standpoint, would this technology be likely to be beneficial? Or are there's some things that suggest maybe it won't be. So I'd like to do a little science. I'm working with some doctors and talking about grants and that kind of stuff, looking at sites for a clinical trial. And I'll try to do some testing in the field and in addition to the laboratory. And if the data looks good, then maybe there'll be a viable product and a company that can come from it.
So being a consultant and actually an entrepreneur, and that's, I guess, an area that our state is trying vigorously to promote. So with your project and the fact that this is in Hawaii, I guess my question is, to get this project off the ground, and given the fact that you are here in the state, what are some of the challenges? Or, well, you talked about the opportunities. What are the challenges?
That's a good question. I think some of the challenges here in Hawaii are the same with any startup anywhere. You've got to find people, you have to put together teams, you have to get financing. I was somewhat pleasantly surprised, actually, to find that a lot, if not all of the expertise we need is here in Hawaii. Hawaii is not really, I think, always viewed as a hotbed of technology development.
Right.
And I think some of that is undeserved. There is a lot of that going on. We tend to think of places like Silicon Valley or Research Triangle in North Carolina or the Boston area for the biotech companies. But we have people here who have the expertise to do it, and we can do it. And I think the state would benefit from diversification, because the traditional industries here are tourism, agriculture, and military. Other people can speak better to the state's economics than I can, but I'm not sure many people would say that agriculture is a big growing industry for us right now. Tourism has a relatively mature state right now, and certainly people believe it can grow, but it has its ups and downs. The military is subject to some extent to government funding, federal funding.
Going through that right now.
We know all about that. So technology has a potential to develop good paying jobs here and to have another leg of the economy. There are a lot of people trying to do it. I'm not sure I know yet why some people are successful, some aren't. There's a certain amount of magic in any startup, and I'm not sure I know what the magic is or where the magic comes from. I'm hoping I have some magic in my project.
I hope so too.
But I know people who are working really hard on it, and some are being successful, and some are not being successful. But I do know there's a big community of people here who want it to be successful, and they're trying to pull together all the resources needed so that we can have more successes. And I'm hoping that maybe we'll be part of it, or I can contribute to it either from my own project or from my IP work, either teaching or helping people with their IP. I still do some consulting on IP. So it's a community I hope to contribute to.
And I hope you have the magic for it. And you have to tell me all about your projects in the near future, I hope.
I'd be happy to.
Thank you, Stuart. It's been great to have you on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. My guest is Stuart Huang. He is a lecturer of law at the Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. We've been talking about his career as an intellectual property attorney and recently his project in the healthcare field. My name is Alice Lee Hagan. You've been watching ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Please join us again next week. Aloha.